My name is Claire Mercer, and when my father died, my brother didn't just take more than I did. He took the keys, the accounts, the board, the story, and the $3.2 million company my father built with our last name on the door. Then he took the worst thing of all. He took my work and taught everyone around us to call it his. Grant Mercer was always the golden child. He was the son who looked right in a suit, sounded calm in a room, and knew how to smile while other people did the hard parts. I was the daughter who built things nobody clapped for. I was the engineer. I was the one who stayed late, broke systems down, tested them again, filled yellow legal pads with drawings, and made the company's most profitable irrigation design actually work. That patent was mine. Not the family's in some warm, symbolic way. Not Dad's in the vague way he liked to describe everything when he wanted peace more than truth. Mine. But a week after the funeral, Grant stood in our boardroom, looked at me like I was a liability, and told everyone I was too emotional to understand real business. They believed him. Or maybe they didn't believe him exactly. Maybe they just preferred him because men like my brother make people feel safe right up until the ceiling caves in. He cut my royalty checks. He locked me out. He took the company's future and told the room I had never really understood what I was looking at. And for a while it worked. That was the deepest loss. Not the money. Not even the building. It was watching a whole room let him erase me in real time. Watching people who had watched me build the thing look relieved when a man with my last name and a steadier voice told them he had it handled. If you've ever had someone steal your work by sounding calmer than you, stay with me. This one didn't end with a screaming match. It ended with a clause. And 7 years later, that clause turned off my brother's life the way someone flips a switch and a whole row of screens goes black. My father's company was called Mercer Ag Systems, which sounded bigger than it was when I was a kid and smaller than it became by the time he died. We were based in California's Central Valley. We sold irrigation control systems, retrofits, pressure management kits, field monitoring packages, and the kind of water efficiency upgrades growers started caring about once water stopped being something they could waste without thinking. Dad built the business the slow way. One county, then another. One relationship at a time. He understood farmers, district managers, and old-school buyers who trusted a handshake more than a glossy brochure. Grant grew up in the part of the company people could see. He rode with Dad to client lunches. He learned names. He learned how to stand with one hand on the back of a chair and sound like he had already solved the problem before anyone finished describing it. When customers came by the office, Dad would clap him on the shoulder and say, "That boy can sell snow to a rancher." Everybody laughed. Grant laughed too, like he had been born with ownership in his bones. I grew up in the back room. Not literally, but close enough. I spent more time around prototypes, wiring diagrams, pressure tables, and testing rigs than I did around Dad's clients. By 15 I could tell when a manifold design was going to fail under inconsistent load just by looking at it. By 19 I was helping the field teams troubleshoot performance issues nobody else could isolate. By 24, after 2 years of obsessive work, I designed the pressure balancing control sequence that became the patent my brother later built his whole legend on. Dad loved to pretend our roles were equal. That was one of his favorite lies. Not because he wanted to hurt me. That would have almost been cleaner. He wanted harmony. He wanted the family to feel intact. He wanted the son who made him proud in public, and the daughter he relied on in private. So he developed a talent for splitting truth down the middle until it no longer looked like truth at all. In public, he talked about our kids and family effort. In private, he came into my workspace after everybody else had gone home, stood over my shoulder, and said things like, "You're the only one in this building who sees the whole system." I used to live off those sentences. That was my first mistake. Because private recognition feels like love when you're young. Later you learn it can also be a way of keeping you useful without ever making you safe. The patent started as a problem we couldn't solve cheaply. Growers wanted better water efficiency, but our older systems bled margin because the pressure response wasn't precise enough across varied field conditions. We were losing bids to competitors who promised cleaner control curves, and Dad hated losing more than he hated expense. I spent months building test models, reworking sequences, and chasing one ugly little failure point after another until I came up with a design that stabilized pressure response in a way our existing product line never had. It wasn't magic. It was work. Ugly, patient, unglamorous work. The kind that ruins weekends and makes your neck stiff and leaves cold coffee rings on engineering notes you don't realize are important until years later. When the test results finally came in, the improvement wasn't theoretical. It was obvious: better performance, better efficiency, better retention for customers, better margins for us. It turned our retrofit kits from decent sellers into something close to an engine. Dad knew it the second he saw the data. He sat at the edge of my workbench tapping the pages with one finger and said, "This is the one." I remember that moment because I was so tired I almost cried. Not because I thought he was going to make a scene for me. Dad never did that. But because for once I thought the truth was going to be too large to soften. I thought he would have to say it out loud. I thought he would have to look at Grant and the board and the long line of men who loved talking about leadership and tell them who had just changed the company. He didn't. Not really. He hired outside counsel, he filed the patent properly. He made sure the inventor records were clean. He insisted on dated development logs and signed testing memos. He had me keep my original notebooks in a fireproof cabinet, and told the controller to duplicate key files off-site. He protected the work. He just didn't protect me from the family story around the work. That's an important distinction. I didn't understand it then. The patent went through and our numbers changed within 18 months. Growers wanted the new system. Regional buyers noticed. Margins improved. Dad started talking about our proprietary water efficiency advantage in meetings, and every time he said, our people looked at him first, then Grant, because Grant was already being trained as the face of the next era. I was in the room but not in the story. When I tried to explain the technical edge at one distributor presentation, Grant cut in halfway through and said, smiling, "Claire lives in the weeds. What she means is we made it simpler and smarter." Everybody nodded like he had translated me into something useful. Dad didn't correct him. That happened a lot. Not always dramatically. Usually in smaller ways that trained people how to see us. I'd explain a design risk and Grant would summarize it back in broader, cleaner language and get credit for clarity. I'd flag a production issue and Dad would tell the room, "Grant and I have been talking about that." A district manager once shook my hand after a meeting and said, "You're lucky your brother knows how to sell what you people come up with." You people? I smiled. I was still trying to be gracious back then. There were moments though when I could see the structure Dad was building underneath the performance. He never said, "Grant isn't capable of carrying this alone." That would have required honesty he didn't have. Instead, he said careful things. "Keep your notebooks. Don't sign loose language. If it isn't written, it didn't happen." Once when outside counsel was going over licensing language, Dad cut the attorney off and said, "No. Make that section clearer. If something ever gets contested, I want there to be no room for memory." I remember the attorney looking at him a second too long before nodding. At the time I thought it was just founder paranoia. Dad was always like that with paperwork. He trusted people emotionally and then built legal structures like he didn't trust anyone at all. Now I think he knew exactly what house he lived in. The patent wasn't assigned outright into the operating company the way Grant later implied. That matters. Dad had it set up through a licensing structure tied to inventor rights and company use. The company could use the design profit from the design and build product lines around the design, but the license had conditions: royalty payments, reporting obligations, acknowledgement requirements in certain financing disclosures, cure language, reversion language. The company had rights, but not the kind Grant liked to describe when he wanted to sound like a king. Dad didn't explain all of that to me in one clean conversation. That would have been too direct. He just made sure it existed. And because he was Dad, he also made sure Grant never felt threatened by it. He wrapped the truth in enough family language that my brother heard what he wanted to hear. He assumed the company using something meant the company owning it in spirit, and spirit was always the form of ownership. Grant liked best because spirit can't be audited. The older we got, the sharper the split became. Grant got visibility. I got dependence. Dad called me from home at night when there was a technical issue. He asked for my judgment when product teams got stuck. He trusted me with the things that could damage the business if handled badly. But in public, he still made sure Grant was framed as the future. I asked him once why he did that. Not dramatically. Just one night after a supplier dinner when we were loading boxes into his truck and I was tired of pretending I didn't notice. He kept his eyes on the tailgate and said, "People are more comfortable following him." I said, "Even when I'm the one carrying the work." He sighed like I was asking for weather, not truth. Comfort matters in business. That sentence stayed with me for years. Not because it was wise, because it was cowardly. Comfort mattered so much to my father that he let the room get trained to trust the wrong child with the right company. By the time he got sick, the pattern was fixed. Grant sat closer to the front, Grant spoke more in meetings, Grant handled more visible relationships. I handled anything that required precision, memory, or systems thinking. And because the company was doing well, people called it a strong succession setup instead of what it really was, which was a family myth built around the labor of the daughter nobody wanted to make central. Dad never said Grant would get everything. He didn't need to. He let the architecture of expectation do that for him. At family gatherings, aunts would ask Grant when he planned to take over the whole thing. No one asked me whether I wanted the top job. They asked whether I was still enjoying the technical side. Men who had never designed a sprinkler head in their lives praised Grant's instincts over bourbon, and called me brilliant in the careful tone people use when they are complimenting someone they do not intend to empower. Even when the patent started driving the strongest margins in the company, the language around it stayed blurry in public. Our system, our breakthrough, our family innovation. Every time Dad said that, part of me went tight. Not because I wanted applause for ego, because I wanted the record to match the reality while he was still alive enough to say it himself. He never did. The closest he came was 2 months before he died. He had already started shrinking by then, not physically at first, in energy, in appetite. In that way people do when they know their body has crossed into some territory they might not come back from. I was in his office going over a reporting issue tied to one of the royalty schedules, and he asked me where my original development logs were. I said, in the cabinet. Same place. He nodded. Then he said, good. Keep them. I laughed a little because it sounded like him still worrying about paper while his own health was slipping. He looked at me harder than he had in weeks and said, I'm serious. Keep every original. The one who looks like the owner usually isn't the one who built the lock. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, I took it as one of his cryptic founder sayings and went back to work. 3 months later he was dead. And a week after that I learned what happens when a man spends years privately relying on the right child while publicly training everyone to follow the wrong one. Dad's funeral was on a Thursday. Grant cried beautifully. That sounds cruel, but it's true. He knew when to lower his voice, when to grip someone's shoulder, when to pause long enough to look devastated without losing control. People kept saying how strong he was, how proud Dad would be, how lucky the company was to have continuity. I stood there in black heels with my chest burning and watched grief turn into succession theater in real time. There are moments in a family when the future becomes visible before anyone says it out loud. At the church reception hall, one of Dad's longtime buyers hugged me and then stepped right past me to tell Grant, your father built something special. You'll take care of it. Grant didn't correct him. He put on the sad smile and said, that's the plan. That night, before the flowers were even all the way dead, he asked the office manager to forward the executive call list to his personal phone. On Friday, he had the building keys. On Monday, he had Dad's assistant routing incoming vendor issues through him. By Tuesday, he was speaking in the first-person plural about decisions nobody had discussed with me. I still hadn't fully processed the funeral. I was sleeping badly, eating because I knew I should, and moving through those first days like my body understood the world had changed faster than my mind did. The worst part wasn't that Grant moved quickly. It was how natural everyone found it. As if my father dying had simply removed the one last obstacle between my brother and the role the room had always wanted him to have. The board meeting was set for the following Wednesday. Grant told me it was routine. He said they needed to reassure lenders, staff, and key customers. He said, try not to take anything personally. We just need stability right now. That was the first time he used that tone with me. Soft, patronizing, managerial. Like my father's body was barely in the ground and he was already practicing how to talk down to me in a voice that sounded reasonable to other people. I should tell you something important about that room. Nobody in it was a comic book villain. That's why what happened there was so dangerous. These were not cackling thieves. They were respectable adults. A banker with a clean tie and careful hands. 2 board members who cared more about continuity than truth. An operations director who hated conflict. A family friend who had watched us grow up and preferred the version of reality that required the least emotional disruption. People like that can do enormous harm while still believing they are being practical. Grant arrived with a leather folder, and the expression men wear when they want to look burdened by responsibility. I arrived with 3 hours of sleep and a folder full of notes I naively believed would matter. He opened by talking about Dad's legacy. Then he talked about customer confidence, then staff morale, then lender stability, then market perception. It was very clean, very adult, very sober. Then he got to me. He didn't attack me directly. That would have been clumsy. He said I was invaluable on the technical side. He said the family needed to protect me from being pulled into executive stress too soon while I was still grieving. He said I'd always been more comfortable in development than in leadership. Then he smiled the way only a sibling can smile when they have spent your whole life learning exactly how to reduce you in front of other people. Claire is brilliant, he said. But we all know she takes things hard. Right now, the worst thing we could do is put her in a role where emotion gets mistaken for judgment. Nobody gasped. That's the part I remember most. Nobody gasped. One board member shifted in his seat. Another nodded like this was unfortunate but sensible. The banker wrote something down. Dad's old friend, the one who had eaten at our house since I was 14, looked at me with pity. Pity. Like I was the sad, smart daughter who had to be protected from her own feelings while the son stepped up and became the man of the hour. I tried to speak. I really did. I started explaining that the company's strongest margins were tied to the patented control sequence, that the license structure needed to be handled correctly, that royalty reporting and inventor acknowledgement could not be treated casually during a transition. I had facts, dates, process, exposure. Grant let me finish just long enough for the room to feel tired. Then he leaned back and said, "This is exactly what I mean. We're talking about keeping the business steady, and Claire is spiraling into technical weeds. About the patent that was carrying the company." A board member asked whether there was any actual risk. Grant said no. "We're talking about internal family paperwork, not a real operational threat." That line did more damage than the insult. Because once he said that, the room relaxed. They had their frame. They had their adult son, their grieving daughter, and their permission structure. Anything I said after that sounded emotional because he had already defined the category I was allowed to exist in. The vote was not called a vote. Of course it wasn't. They used phrases like interim authority, continuity, posture, temporary management, concentration. Respectable words for a dirty little family decision. Grant got operational control. Grant got bank-facing authority. Grant got signing access. Grant got the story. And I got the soft language women have been buried under for generations, valued, protected, not best placed for this phase. By the time the meeting ended, I knew I had lost more than a title. I had lost authorship in the one room where authorship could still have been defended before the lie hardened. Over the next 2 weeks, the theft became practical. My login lost access. My reporting requests stalled. Vendor calls stopped coming to me. The royalty checks ceased without explanation. When I asked the controller about it, she wouldn't look me in the eye for more than a second. Her name was Marlene. She had been with Dad for 21 years. She wasn't weak, but she had a mortgage and 2 kids and a board full of men who wanted the transition to feel smooth. She said quietly, "Grant asked us to hold anything that could complicate the estate picture until council reviews it." I said royalty obligations aren't optional because he wants fewer complications. She swallowed and said, "I know." That word stayed with me too. I know. Not "I'll fix it." Not "you're right." Just the little graveyard phrase people use when they have already decided not to stand beside the truth. A few days later, Grant asked me to come in for what he called a clean conversation. He had already moved into Dad's office. I should say that plainly because even now it still strikes me. My father had been dead less than 3 weeks, and Grant was sitting behind his desk, one wrist resting on the armrest like he had been rehearsing that posture his whole life. He offered me coffee. I said no. Then he slid a folder across the desk. Severance. Confidentiality language. A consultant option dressed up as generosity. He said, "I think this gives you room to heal without pressure." I said, "You stopped my royalty checks." He sighed like I was proving his point. "Claire, this is exactly the kind of thing I mean. Everything doesn't have to become a legal crisis just because you feel pushed out. Feel pushed out. Like he hadn't already changed access authority reporting and compensation. Like exile was a mood. I said, "That patent is mine." He gave me a look I had seen on men in meetings who were about to explain my own work back to me. "It's part of the company's operation," he said. Dad structured things for the family. Nobody is trying to steal from you. That was the moment something in me went cold. Not because I believed him, because I realized he believed himself. Grant's most dangerous trait was never cruelty. It was entitlement so complete he could commit theft and experience it as order. He had been chosen by the room for so long that he mistook preference for principle. I didn't sign. He told me not to make things uglier than they had to be. He said lenders were watching. He said staff needed confidence. He said Dad would hate seeing us tear the company apart. That last one almost got me, not because it was true, because it used the only ghost in the room heavier than him. I left without yelling. That bothered him more than anger would have. A week later I came in to clear my things out of the development office. The board had already circulated an internal note praising Grant for stepping into leadership during a difficult season. People spoke to me with careful sympathy, which is one of the ugliest tones in the world when you know the sympathy is there to replace respect. I packed one banker's box, a framed field photo, a mug, some reference binders, and my old notebooks. That was all I took that mattered. While I was taping the box shut, I heard applause down the hallway. Not loud, not movie loud, office loud. The kind that happens when people are relieved someone told them what the story is, and now they can stop thinking. I stood there holding a roll of tape and realized they were clapping for my brother while I packed up the design history of the thing he was using to crown himself. That was the real bottom. Not losing the office. Not losing the money. Losing the room. He didn't throw me out because I was weak. He threw me out because he needed the room to forget whose idea was keeping the company alive. For the first few months after I left, anger was too hot to be useful. I kept replaying sentences. Too emotional, technical weeds. Heal without pressure. Every time I did, I wanted to drive back to Mercer Ag Systems, walk into the lobby and drag the truth into daylight with both hands. But rage is expensive and I had already paid enough. So I did what I had been trained to do since I was young. I went back to the records. I reread my development logs. I opened the inventor memos. I laid out the licensing documents at my dining table and forced myself to read them, not as the daughter who had been erased but as the person Dad had always quietly prepared me to be when the room stopped being safe. That was when the shape of the trap finally came into focus. The company did not own the patent cleanly. It had a license. An exclusive operating license in the agricultural irrigation field, yes. Valuable, broad, profitable, yes. But still a license. And that license had obligations. Royalty obligations, disclosure obligations. Change of control language. Cure periods. And one clause buried late enough in the addendum that only someone who respected paper would read it with the seriousness it deserved. Dad's outside counsel had written in a 7-year protected term after his death. During that term, the company could keep using the patent under the original license framework, but only if it remained compliant. If royalties were not paid, if material misrepresentations about ownership or inventor rights were made in financing or governance records, and if those breaches were not cured under the defined process, then, at the end of that 7-year term, the exclusive operating rights could revert without further consent. In plain English, the company got time, not immunity. And time only helped if the people running it were disciplined enough not to poison their own claim. Grant had stopped the royalties almost immediately. Grant had started talking about the patent as if it were fully company-owned. Grant had positioned himself publicly as the sole inheritor of a technology he had never designed. At first I sat there in silence, feeling something I hadn't felt since the boardroom. Not hope. Hope was too soft. Recognition. This was not a vague moral injury anymore. It was a sequence. A sequence with dates. A sequence with breach. A sequence with an ending. That did not mean I could march back in and win. Life is not that kind. The clause wasn't a magic spell. It was leverage, and leverage is useless when you throw it too early into a room full of people who still want the prettier lie. So I kept reading. I pulled the old correspondence archive. There were emails from outside counsel marked to Dad, me the controller, and yes, Grant. Not detailed explanations to Grant because he never read details unless they made him money fast. But enough to show that he had been copied on the structure and treated like an adult expected to understand it. I found one reply from him that made my stomach drop. Fine. Keep the inventor language if it makes Claire comfortable. We all know the company is what matters. He had written that years before Dad died. He had told on himself in a single sentence. He had seen the language. He had dismissed it as sentimental. He had assumed my legal position was emotional decoration. That email became the hinge in my mind. Because it told me something important. My brother did not win by outsmarting me. He won by standing in a room that already wanted him and treating the legal architecture beneath that preference like a formality. That made him dangerous in the short term. It also made him fragile over time. The more I tracked the company from a distance, the worse the picture got for him. He leaned harder into the patented product line every year. Publicly available marketing language called it the company's signature efficiency platform. Distributor materials referenced the control sequence like it was a settled company asset. Grant did interviews in trade publications talking about our proprietary system and the innovation my father built the company around in its later phase. Not the design my sister created. Not the licensed technology requiring compliance. Our proprietary system. The arrogance would have been almost funny if it hadn't been built out of my own life. The company expanded too. New debt, new growth talk, new pressure. By year 3 it was obvious Grant was doing what sons like him always do when early success confirms their mythology. He started confusing momentum with mastery. He opened new territories too quickly, hired in glossy bursts signed contracts because expansion photographs better than discipline, and let debt hide inside optimism. By year 5 I could see the pattern I needed. The patented system was not a side product. It was the margin engine. The company's best numbers were tied to the one piece of value he had built his future on without understanding its legal frame. And banks do not love founders. Banks do not love golden children. Banks do not love family narratives. Banks love enforceable rights. That was when I stopped asking how he had done this to me. I started asking what would happen when the calendar reached the date he never bothered to understand. I didn't spend those 7 years hiding and stewing, but I also didn't spend them turning into one of those inspirational liars people post about to make pain sound clean. Rebuilding wasn't clean. It was humiliating first. I left Mercer Ag with a box, a damaged reputation inside our regional network, and the kind of family silence that feels louder than conflict. People didn't call me a liar outright. They just behaved like Grant's version was more practical. I was the difficult sister. The technical one. The one who couldn't let it go. So I went where the work still spoke louder than family politics. At first it was contract engineering. Water efficiency consulting. Field assessments for firms that didn't care whose daughter I was as long as I could solve what they paid me to solve. It bruised my pride. I had helped build a company, and suddenly I was walking into conference rooms as the outsider again, proving competence from scratch to men 10 years less qualified who still asked whether I'd be joining the operational side. Eventually. But distance did something the family never had. It made me legible on my own terms. Clients who had never met Grant didn't hear too emotional when I talked. They heard precision. Municipal teams heard clarity. Growers heard practicality. Partner firms heard someone who knew both systems and failure points, someone who had built real tools instead of just selling polished language around them. I learned new things too. Not engineering things. Business things. The parts Dad had always shielded from me in public while privately relying on my judgment anyway. I learned how lenders think about collateral confidence. I learned how licensing exposure can quietly infect financing. I learned the ugly beauty of sequence, how being right too soon can still lose you the room, and how the same truth at the correct pressure point can reorder a company in an afternoon. I learned not to speak just because I was hurt. That might have been the hardest lesson of my adult life. There were so many times I wanted to strike early. When I saw one of Grant's interviews in a trade magazine calling the irrigation platform a family innovation I helped scale from the ground up. When a former vendor mentioned he was shopping a larger credit facility. When a distant cousin told me with fake sympathy that Grant had really carried so much since your father passed. When one of the old board members sent me a Christmas card 2 years after the betrayal and wrote, "I hope you found a path that suits you." A path that suits you. Like I'd wandered off into a hobby while my brother nobly upheld the family legacy. I kept all of it. Not physically, not always, but mentally, cleanly, not because bitterness was feeding me, because memory without discipline becomes self-harm, and I was done bleeding for people who mistook my silence for weakness. I built a quieter life, a better one in some ways. I worked with firms that respected documentation. I got pulled into system audits because I had the kind of mind that sees what people have been stepping around. I learned how to translate engineering risk into language executives and attorneys both understood. I earned enough to breathe. Enough to stop fantasizing about dramatic vindication and start thinking like someone who could survive without it. That mattered. Because dependence is what keeps people crawling back to families that broke them. And I was not going to crawl. I also kept every record I had a right to keep. Original notebooks, signed testing logs, inventor documentation, royalty schedules, the licensing binder, the off-site duplicate index Dad had insisted on years before. Emails, archived draft language, anything that established sequence authorship notice and breach. I did not weaponize it yet. I organized it. There's a difference. Around year 4, I consulted an attorney for the first time, not because I wanted to sue immediately but because I wanted to test my own reading of the structure against someone who didn't share my blood and didn't care about my brother's charm. Her name was Andrea Bell. She had the kind of calm that makes sloppy men nervous. She read for a long time without interrupting me. Then she tapped one section in the addendum and said, "Your father's counsel wrote this for a future conflict he was too sentimental to name." I said, "Do I have a case?" She looked at me and said, "You have leverage. A case is what people talk about when they're already late." That sentence changed me. Because it put words to something I had been slowly becoming without naming. I did not need a dramatic fight to feel whole. I needed timing. I needed the right pressure point. I needed the company to become dependent enough on the patent and careless enough with the compliance that the truth would hurt where it had previously only annoyed. Andrea told me not to announce anything. Not to threaten. Not to send emotional letters that would give him time to contain the damage. She said truth matters. Sequence matters more. So I watched, quietly. Grant kept growing into the part he had stolen, which meant he kept making the same category error over and over. He thought performing ownership was the same as securing ownership. He thought public repetition could flatten legal nuance. He thought because the company had been using my design for years, the question of who truly controlled that use would never become operational enough to matter. He was wrong. By year 6, the company's debt posture looked tighter. Their expansion had gotten heavier. Trade rumors started sounding less admiring and more hungry, aggressive, leveraged, pushing hard into the next cycle. There was talk of a renewed banking arrangement that would roll existing exposure forward while positioning for more scale. I knew what that meant. More scrutiny, more disclosure, more moments where loose language about core IP could stop being family myth and start becoming a lender problem. Then came the year 7 date. It sat in my mind for months before it arrived. Not like a birthday, like weather forming offshore. Andrea and I reviewed everything again. Royalty defaults, documentation trail, public and private representations. Notice sequence, cure failure. The language was still as strong as I had first seen it. Stronger maybe because time had made the pattern uglier. Grant had not merely inherited a messy situation. He had built 7 years of executive posture on top of an uncured breach, and a lie he repeated so often he started thinking repetition itself had legal force. By then I knew something else too. I did not want his apology. That used to confuse me. Early on, I thought vindication meant hearing him admit it. Hearing him say my name and the word mine in the same sentence. Hearing him crack. But time stripped that fantasy down. Apologies are only useful from people who understand harm. Grant understood consequences, not harm. So when the call finally came through Andrea's office that Mercer Ag was in the middle of a lender review tied to a refinancing package and governance update, I did not feel rage. I felt ready. Tell me something in the comments. In a family business, how often does "you're the responsible one" really mean you'll do the work while someone else gets the credit? Because by the time year 7 arrived, I had learned that the quiet child in the back room is usually carrying more of the future than the loud child at the head of the pay table. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in the same boardroom where I had been erased. That mattered more than I expected. Not because I'm sentimental about rooms, but because spaces remember hierarchy, and walking back into that one after 7 years felt like stepping into a scar that had finally decided to open the right way. Mercer Ag had invited Andrea and me under the polite fiction of clarifying patent continuity during a lender diligence session. That phrase alone told me Grant was already nervous, even if he was still pretending otherwise. Men like him only use the word clarify when something they have spent years oversimplifying is about to cost them money. The board was there. So was Marlene, older and tighter around the mouth than I remembered. So was a bank representative on video and outside counsel for the lender on another screen. Grant stood near the end of the table, one hand on a chair, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He smiled when I walked in, not warmly, not cruelly either. Dismissively. Like I was a difficult chapter turning up late in a book he thought he had already finished. "Claire," he said. "Didn't expect theatrics." Andrea pulled out her chair and sat down without looking at him. I stayed standing 1 second longer than everyone wanted. Then I said, "You didn't expect paper." That got a small silence. Not a dramatic one. Just enough for the room to register that the script he preferred might not hold. Grant recovered first, of course. He always did. Fast, polished, calm. "We're here to make sure the bank has the comfort it needs on legacy IP. This doesn't need to become family theater." There it was again. Comfort, the family word for burial. The bank lawyer on screen said we'd appreciate a clean chain of rights explanation on the pressure control patent family and any inventor-side claims. Any inventor-side claims. I almost smiled at the distance in that phrase. 7 years of theft, humiliation, erased labor and private rage reduced to any inventor-side claims. Strange how often that's the form justice takes when it finally approaches. Not emotionally, administratively. Grant launched in. He said the company had used the system continuously for years. True. He said it was developed during the active life of the business under Dad's leadership. Also true in the lazy, flattening way truth becomes dangerous. He said the company had relied on it in good faith through succession. That one was filth in a tie. Then he used the phrase internally resolved historical family questions. Historical family questions. I looked at Marlene. She looked down. Andrea waited until he was done. Then she opened the original licensing binder. Not a copy. Not a printout from a scanned folder. The original binder with the tabs Dad's outside counsel had labeled years earlier and the signatures placed exactly where they needed to be. That was the first turn in the room. Paper has a sound when it lands on polished wood. A simple sound. But in certain rooms under certain conditions it hits like a shot. Andrea said, "This is not an internal family question. This is a licensed core asset with uncured default issues and a matured reversion framework." Grant laughed. Actually laughed. Not because he was relaxed. Because men like him laugh when they think tone can still beat substance. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We've operated under this structure for years." Andrea didn't blink. "Yes?" Non-compliantly. The bank rep on screen leaned forward. Andrea started with the cleanest point first. Inventor records, my name, signed development logs, filed authorship, then the license. Quarterly royalty obligations. Disclosure obligations tied to inventor acknowledgement and patent control representations. Notice language, cure language. Then the addendum. The 7-year protected term after Dad's death. The reversion mechanism for uncured breach and material misrepresentation. Andrea spoke like she was reading Whether Not Detonating a Family Myth. Grant tried the old move. He leaned back, exhaled and said, "This is what happens when technical people treat administrative language like destiny." Technical people? Administrative language. That was when I finally spoke. Not loudly, just clearly. "You stopped the royalty checks in the month after Dad died," I said. "You represented the patent as if the company owned it outright. You built financing posture on a license you never read carefully enough to respect. That's not administrative language, Grant. That's your whole life sitting on a default." The room went still. Marlene closed her eyes for half a second. Grant looked at her then, which told me everything. He already knew which witness in the room could hurt him fastest. Andrea slid over the royalty schedule and the stoppage record. Then the archived email where Grant had been copied on the inventor language and dismissed it. Then excerpts from trade materials and financing language using ownership phrasing that went far beyond what the license allowed. The lender's counsel interrupted for the first time. Was there ever a written cure accepted by the inventor or inventor's counsel after the payment stoppage? Grant said. "This is a family company. We didn't treat every internal issue as adversarial." Which was not an answer. The lawyer repeated, "Was there a written cure?" No one spoke. Andrea said no. Then Marlene, in a voice so quiet the room had to lean toward her, said, "I told him the royalty hold would create exposure." Grant snapped his head toward her. "Marlene," she kept going. "I told him the license used the word shall. I told him I was uncomfortable changing the payment schedule without formal review." There it was. Not a confession from a cartoon villain. Something better. A witness. A competent woman who had watched the breach happen and had warned him. Grant tried to push harder. "This is absurd. The company has invested millions into scaling that platform." Andrea said, "Investment does not replace compliance." The bank rep asked for a pause. One of the side screens in the room had been showing the company's lender portal and projection deck. Cash forecasts. Facility terms. Renewal modeling. The stuff executives love staring at when they still believe numbers can outrun structure. The bank rep muted for a moment, then came back and said, "Given what has now been represented, we are suspending advancement on the renewal package pending immediate legal review of chain of rights, default exposure and prior disclosure accuracy." And then the screens went dark. Not metaphorically. The lender portal session terminated. The projection deck vanished. Both monitors went black at almost the exact same second because somebody on the bank's end cut access to the working session while legal review took over. I had imagined revenge many different ways in the first year after the betrayal. None of them were as cold as that. No screaming, no thrown glass. Just two black screens in the room where my brother had once called me too emotional to understand business. He looked at them first. That's what I remember most. Not me. Not Andrea. The screens. Because that's when he understood it wasn't a family argument anymore. It was institutional. His favorite form of power, being the calmest man in the room, was useless once the room belonged to process. One of the board members started talking about next steps in a cracked little management voice. Grant cut him off. He looked at me and said, "You're really doing this?" After Dad, that line would have destroyed me 7 years earlier. Now it only clarified him. Because even then, with the binder open and the bank pulling back and Marlene having spoken, he still thought the sin was not theft. The sin was forcing consequence. I said, "You did this. I just brought the original paperwork." He took a step toward me, then finally dropping the polished tone. "You'd burn the company down over a clause," and there it was, the sentence the whole story had been walking toward. I said, "You didn't inherit the engine, Grant. You inherited the bill for pretending it was yours." No one moved. Not for a second. That was the true inversion. 7 years earlier I had been the unstable one in the room, the woman speaking facts. Nobody wanted to treat as facts because a smoother person had translated them into inconvenience. Now every face at that table was turned toward the same binder, the same dates, the same dead certainty of signatures placed years before any of them imagined they would matter this much. If someone publicly humiliated you and the truth finally humiliated them in public, is that justice, or does it become revenge the second you decide not to soften it? I'm asking because that room taught me something ugly and useful. Most people do not object to cruelty. They object to consequences arriving in front of witnesses. Vindication didn't happen in one grand speech. That's another fantasy people keep about these stories. That the right sentence lands and everybody suddenly sees the light. Real vindication is slower than that. Cleaner too. It stacks. Andrea kept going. She laid out the inventor records in sequence. My original notebooks. Dated development logs. Internal test reports signed by engineering staff. Patent filing documents showing me as inventor. Early licensing drafts tying company use to defined obligations. Final executed language. Royalty schedules. Payment history. Payment stoppage. No cure acceptance. No revised agreement. No written waiver from me. No valid transfer erasing my inventor side control. Then came the correspondence. The email where outside counsel circulated updated language before execution. Dad's response asking that the inventor acknowledgement section stay strong. Grant's dismissive reply. Another later email from Marlene asking whether a change in reporting posture after Dad's declining health required special review under the addendum. No one had answered her directly. Then a note from her to Grant after the royalty stoppage flagged urgent. Per license terms, holding inventor side payments without formal cure process may create reversion exposure later. Please advise. He had forwarded it with one line. We'll clean this up after transition. Do not escalate. That line mattered more than any family memory ever could. Because it took the whole situation out of the realm of misunderstanding. He knew there was exposure. He chose delay. He assumed delay would always be enough. The Lenders' Council asked whether the company had represented the patented system as a wholly controlled asset in prior financing discussions. One board member tried to soften it by saying language had probably been used in a commercially customary way. Andrea replied, "Commercial custom does not rewrite a license." Then Marlene did something I will respect her for until the day I die. She slid a folder across the table. She had brought backup records, not enough to save me 7 years earlier. She will live with that and so will I. But enough to stop the room from pretending now. Quarterly internal summaries, payment holds, notes from accounting review, a compliance checklist left unfinished during the transition after Dad's death. Margin reports showing exactly how central the patented platform had become. The numbers were brutal in their own quiet way. Grant had not merely benefited from my design. He had built dependency on top of breach. The board finally stopped trying to sound managerial and started sounding frightened. Because once the bank stepped back, the problem was no longer family conflict. It was asset risk, disclosure risk, breach risk, governance risk. Men who had happily nodded along when I was framed as too emotional suddenly became very interested in definitions, dates, and whether anyone had formal notice. It would have been satisfying if it weren't also so disgusting. That's the thing no one tells you about delayed justice. When it comes, it doesn't make people better. It just removes the luxury of their preferred lie. Grant still tried. Of course he did. He said Dad intended the company to retain everything. He said I had never raised the issue in good faith during earlier years. Andrea asked whether non-payment and exclusion from governance had in his view encouraged a collaborative cure process. He didn't answer. He said the company had invested in the platform beyond my original design. Andrea said derivative scaling does not extinguish inventor-side rights under the existing documents. He said I was using technicality to destroy the family. I said, a technicality is just what dishonest people call the sentence they thought nobody would finish reading. That was the line that finally broke the atmosphere. Not because people applauded. They didn't. Because the banker on screen stopped speaking to Grant as the unquestioned operating authority and started referring to the company in a tone that no longer assumed he would remain its face. Titles shift before people realize they're shifting. Power does too. By the end of that meeting, the immediate consequences were not theatrical. They were better. The renewal package was suspended. The company's banking exposure was frozen pending legal review. No new draws. No clean certification. No quiet continuation of the same story. The board initiated emergency review of governance representations and chain of rights disclosures. Andrea sent formal notice preserving my inventor-side position and the matured reversion rights. Mercer Ag's strongest margin engine had just become the least stable line on its books, and the most satisfying moment of all came from a man I barely knew. The Lenders' Council, after reviewing the key sequence twice, said, "For the record, the company's right to continue exclusive use appears materially impaired, absent Miss Mercer's written accommodation." Miss Mercer. Not Claire, the difficult daughter. Not the emotional sister. Not internal family noise. Miss Mercer. Then he said something even better. The inventor position must be treated as controlling for review purposes. Controlling. That word sat in the room like clean steel. 7 years earlier, the board had clapped while I packed one box and left with my notebooks. Now a lender's lawyer was using my legal position to define the whole room's next reality. That was vindication. Not because it healed me, because it ended the erasure. Tell me this. If justice comes late but finally costs the right person everything, does it still count as justice? Or does justice only feel pure when it arrives before the damage? I ask because by the time that meeting ended I knew something hard. Getting the truth on record does not give you back the years they lived well off your silence. It just stops them from taking more. The family response was uglier after the meeting than during it. That was predictable. Public structures tend to become honest faster than private families do. Within 48 hours I got the first call from an aunt who had not meaningfully checked on me in years. She opened with, "Sweetheart, I know emotions are high." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because even after all that paper, all that proof, all that formal language, the family still wanted to drag me back into the one role that had protected Grant his whole life, the emotional one, the one whose pain was less credible than a man's calm. I cut her off and said, "This is not about emotions. It's about rights and misrepresentation." She went quiet for half a beat, then tried the next old move. "But do you really want to hurt the company your father built?" There it was. The final trap. Not can Grant survive this. Not was what he did wrong. Not should the board have listened to you 7 years ago. No. Would I now use my recovered position to save the exact structure that had been used to erase me? That's where families like mine always go when the truth finally corners the right person. They stop asking for fairness and start asking the injured person to become noble on command. I said no. Not to everything. Just no in the way that mattered. No, I would not restore Grant's authority. No, I would not sign away the reversion rights to preserve his image. No, I would not accept an apology packaged as urgent business necessity. No, I would not perform healings so the people who failed me could feel less implicated. But I also knew something my brother never had to learn. A company is not just a thief. It is also payroll, field staff, operations people, technicians, families who did not sit in that boardroom and call me too emotional. That complicated things. Not morally in the cheap way. Practically, the easiest version of revenge would have been total collapse. Let the line die. Let the company choke. Let every person who hitched themselves to Grant's certainty discover what certainty built on theft costs. Part of me wanted that. The younger part, the week after the funeral part. The woman with a box and a roll of tape while people clapped down the hall. But I wasn't her anymore. Pain had changed me, yes. So had competence. I knew exactly where to cut, and I knew exactly what I did not want to become. So Andrea and I made an offer. Not generous, not soft, structured. Temporary use could continue only under a new written accommodation with inventor control, explicitly recognized arrears and review built into the framework, and Grant removed from any role that gave him unilateral authority over my patent rights or related disclosures. The board hated it because it was fair in a way that left no room for mythology. Grant hated it because it proved something he could not survive emotionally. Without my work, without my signature, without the right to casually stand on my invention and call it family property, he was not the natural heir. He was a man who had mistaken being chosen for being capable. He called me once after the offer went through. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Not because I wanted closure. Because I wanted to hear what he sounded like when the room was gone. He didn't start with an apology. Of course not. He started with grievance. "Do you know what you've done?" I looked out the window of my apartment at the late afternoon light on the neighboring building and said, "Yes, you could have handled this privately. I tried to handle it privately 7 years ago. You stopped the checks and locked me out." He exhaled hard, like even now he was amazed I could still be so literal. "This was Dad's company." I said, "That's the problem, Grant. It was never just one man's company. And it was never your story to tell alone." For a second he said nothing. Then very quietly and more honestly than he had ever sounded in a boardroom he said, "You always wanted them to say it was you." That line might sound childish, but it revealed everything. Not you wanted your rights. Not you wanted fairness. You wanted them to say it was you. As if recognition were vanity. As if authorship were ego. As if the entire shape of my loss had been wanting applause instead of not wanting to be erased from my own work. I said no. I wanted the record to stop lying. Then I hung up. That was the closest thing to personal closure he ever gave me. The company survived, though not in the way he would have chosen. There was restructuring, review, narrowing, embarrassing questions, board turnover. The kind of quiet institutional pain that doesn't make headlines but changes careers and family dinners forever. Some employees stayed. Some left. Some probably blamed me because that is what people do when truth arrives carrying invoices. I can live with that. What I could not live with was allowing the old lie back in once the paper had finally done its work, the patent returned to its proper center in the record. My name not as an ornament, not as a sentimental footnote, as inventor, as controlling party for the rights under review, as the person whose work had been treated as family fog until someone with bank exposure learned how to read. Do I wish my father had simply told the truth while he was alive? Yes. Every version of me wishes that. I wish he had stood in one board meeting, one family dinner, one client lunch and said, "This engine is Claire's. My son can sell, my daughter built." It would have changed everything. Or maybe it wouldn't have. Maybe families like ours can hear truth and still choose comfort. Either way, he didn't do it. What he did do was leave behind enough paper to make theft expensive if it was pushed far enough. That is not redemption. But it is not nothing. People like to turn endings into morals because morals are easier than boundaries. So here is mine if you want one. I did not win because I was more patient in some saintly way. I won because I stopped begging the room to love the truth and started waiting for the truth to become expensive to ignore. There is a difference. I did not forgive my brother. That word gets used too cheaply, especially by people who were never asked to swallow themselves to keep a family myth alive. I understood him better by the end. That's not forgiveness. I understood that he had been raised inside applause so constant he started treating reality as something that should eventually conform to him. I understood that my father's favoritism had not simply spoiled him. It had malformed him. It had made him believe competence was what the room reflected back at him. It had made him think calmness was integrity. It had made him lazy in exactly the place that finally destroyed him respect for what existed beneath the story. But understanding someone is not the same as opening the gate again. I built a life after Mercer Ag that did not depend on my family admitting what they had done. That might be the most important part, because when justice finally came I could afford to use it cleanly. I was not negotiating from desperation. I was not clawing for survival. I was standing on my own feet with my own work, my own counsel, and a record strong enough to survive the kind of men who love saying women are emotional whenever women remember details men hoped would die. Sometimes I still think about the box. The one I packed while they clapped for him. For years it lived in my closet. I could have unpacked it all immediately, but I didn't. Partly because I was busy, partly because some objects are easier to survive when they stay closed. After the meeting, after the freeze, after the calls and the restructuring and the final confirmation that the reversion position had done exactly what the clause said it could do, I went home and opened it. The mug was still there. The field photo. The old binders. My notebooks heavier than I remembered. I sat on the floor and flipped through the early pages. Messy handwriting, crossed out diagrams, pressure notes, test failures. That strange little world where invention begins before anyone knows it will matter. I cried then. Not hard, not dramatically. Just enough to let the younger version of me exist for a minute. The woman who thought private praise from her father would eventually become public truth. The woman who still believed doing the work would naturally protect her from the people who benefited from it. The woman who had not yet learned that boundaries are sometimes the only honest inheritance left to claim. When I stood up, I didn't feel healed in the cheap way people mean it. I felt accurate. That was better. Grant had spent 7 years protecting what he took from me. I spent 7 years becoming the person he could never survive in a room with. So tell me 3 things. First, can parental favoritism ruin a child's life even when the family insists it was just love expressed differently? Second, if your own brother stole your work and built a company around that theft, would you still save the business to protect everyone else, or would you let it collapse with him inside it? And third, if justice comes 7 years late, is it still justice? Or is it simply a cleaner kind of revenge when you refuse to forgive the people who only respect the truth once it starts costing them money?